Thanks for attending. And just to start this off, the fact that we're not many more here probably shows that we're pioneers in this area, I should say. I don't understand really how you can do AI in finance and insurance without having all the RegTech pieces in place. So maybe this stage is likely to overtake the other ones in the coming editions of the summit. So again, thanks for attending. My name is Mehrdad Mamaghani. I'm responsible for the data science team at Swedbank's anti-financial crime division. And I've also historically worked as a data scientist myself. I will give an overview of our experiences and daily interactions with regulations, some impediments, and how we're working to achieve higher efficiency. I should also say that in this talk, since this is again a new area, a lot of things that I'll be saying, opinions, are not official statements by the bank. It's personal opinions. So it's a little bit like, see it as a sort of a Twitter feed or something. So again, introduction to Swedbank, AI at Swedbank, beyond this sort of AI and code and everything, and finishing off with some final thoughts. For those of you who don't know Swedbank, the name kind of gives it away, Swedbank. So you have Sweden, obviously, but we also have the 3 Baltic countries as part of our 4 home markets. Not very impressive by British standards, but again, in the Nordics, it's 16.4 million inhabitants who live in these countries, and roughly half of them have one type of engagement or the other with Swedbank. 500,000 corporate customers and 16,000 employees. Obviously, we're also present outside of these 4 home markets, especially the Nordics, Finland, Norway, and Denmark, but also across the globe, providing more, let's say, tailor-made products to corporate customers. Some key performance figures for those who are interested. Probably will make it easier to divide everything by 10 to get a rough idea of these key figures in euros, or 12.5 if you want to convert them to British pound. So that's a little bit about the bank. Anti-financial crime. So in anti-financial crime, some 400 people were serving the entire Swedbank group, which means all countries and all business segments. The division has a tech subdivision, which where I'm housed, and there we have some 26 data scientists who are working on a variety of applications, both anti-financial crime, cyber fraud, but also automation. And again, like many other data science teams, it's a very mixed team, and that's why I put up all the flags, because it's not a very, let's say, typical bank environment. It's a very techie environment. So you have a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds, studying many different topics and having a lot of different degrees from universities. Our core focus is to implement an agile process with end-to-end, and by that I mean literally end-to-end line of sight, and have full cross-functionality in our development. And I'll get to that a little bit later, but usually data science was done in an isolation, in a bubble, but as things progress, as you need to integrate the products with other business processes, you need to have that end-to-end perspective, and that I would say is the biggest challenge, to actually go from a data science team to one that includes the business, regulations, users, and all the rest. So shortly, what does AI at Swedbank look like? I'm not going to go through a lot of different models and packages and stuff that we use, just to give a very short overview of type of applications that we're using and how things look like. So very kind of crudely, data is the starting point, and the finishing point is always integration with some business processes. So in a sense, we're not using AI as a standalone decision maker. We're using AI or data science as an augmenter of decision making. Unsurprisingly, and as we also saw in the talk previously, a lot of effort goes to working with data, basically going from that first bit to the feature bit. Data that we're using is mostly internal data, because it just makes it easier. But going from that data, which comes from some systems that have been there maybe for 5 years, some for 30 years, makes it very tricky to have sort of structured, enriched, and standardized features that we can use in our models. And again, in terms of models, I mean, we just use whatever that creates value for us. Simplest solution is always best, but if we need, we can also use deep learning. We've done that. We've done a lot of that, but deep learning is, I would say, still a little bit early for full integration in a lot of business processes in banking. So what do the applications look like when it comes to anti-money laundering and KYC? Risk classification models is the obvious one. So classifying different customers into different risk levels. Since we're looking again at AML, you don't have a lot of suspicious activities, let's say. So you would do well if you would use deep anomaly detection models, KYC deviation, triage models, which is basically finding a way to sort out the false positives, text matching, and of course a lot of integrations with downstream systems and visualization to be able to see actually what's happening in the transaction networks. Cybersecurity and fraud, I would say the biggest thing that we're doing here is working on producing synthetic data, although it doesn't fit every application in finance that well. If you, again, you have a lot of imbalance in your data, synthetic data won't really capture that as finely as you would expect, but also de-risking in internal processes to look at our internal processes in the bank and to figure out if things are being done correctly, whether human error by some random thing or if there's a systematic problem that occurs there. We've also worked with retail historically, and we continue to be engaged. And there again, the application buffet is really wide, but what we worked with is cash flow prediction, chatbot, NLP-related analysis, and of course, different types of segmentation. So a bunch of different applications there as well. So this gives you a sense of what we're doing, and of course the reggy part, the reg tech kind of thing, of course, is in the first two boxes here. That's where we face a lot of interesting processes. So that's AI and that's Swedbank. So what am I going to talk about now? I mean, now I'm going to begin my rant about complexities that we see when it comes to AI in finance. So complexities, I kind of group them in two categories. The first category should be familiar to most of us, and it's been there for some time. And this is the technical dimension. And a paper was published by 2015, in 2015 by Google, where this was outlined really well. And the idea is that historically making one-off models has not been a major source of concern. So you can make one data science or AI model, it works really fine, you present your PowerPoint, you have your Excel file with the scores, and that's great. But to put it in production seems to be, or has historically been, a huge challenge. And that's the one that has also for us led to many sleepless nights, and also sometimes led to some sort of, let's say, bankruptcy in terms of resources, because we need more and more engineering and more, let's say, we need to rethink our processes to be able to put things in production. So just to kind of keep it brief there, I think this illustration from the paper that I've kind of changed a little bit here captures the essence really well, that the machine learning code, again, this paper is from 7 years ago. We've done a lot to mitigate these things, but this is something that I think we're still facing because banks are not tech companies really. Basically the fact that you have your code, it's great, you have that on your GitHub or you produce it on Kaggle, you just have it there and it looks great. What you're missing is everything else to be able to orchestrate and to have this thing as a seamless product that your users can be using, whether the users are internal or external users, your customers, so to say. And without that, you won't be able to have your standardized, scalable, and stable infrastructure. So that's complexity dimension 1 when it comes to AI in finance. Dimension 2 is risk, compliance, and regulation. And I can start with the figure here. Once maybe you don't see this really well, but you see that it's just something unintelligible. That's what we tried to do once when we wanted to map out what a typical process looks like when it comes to orchestrating a data science model in the bank. And a lot of these steps have to do with checks, product assessments, approvals, and regulations, of course. And they have kind of grown to take more and more resources in every AI initiative to have these requirements and assessments done properly. And when it comes to this bit, not unlike the technical one, we also need to have, we have the technical infrastructure, but we also need to have the administrative, regulatory infrastructure in place. Just to kind of get everything up there, and there is some gap there. There is a gap between the tech crowd, your data scientists, and the regulatory experts, where we need to, bridge it simply. And as a consequence, we need to make sure that all initiatives concerning data, AI, and regulations are collaborative. So you would need to have your private actors, whether it's banking or any other kind of, private actor, governments, authorities, academia, all involved in making sure that all regulations and all types of models that are being used are actually fit for the purpose here, so that you can have safe, of course, but also valuable implementations of AI, because without having these things, you might tend to use not that much AI. You might end up just using your Excel file, so to say. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. The other thing that I thought of touching upon very shortly and kind of reflect upon it was the EU AI Act that came out a year ago. I'm not going to go through it because, again, it's a lot of text. It's 108 pages, at least the English version. So I haven't read them myself. I've browsed through them, and I read some summary from one of our legal experts in the bank. But the aim generally is to harmonize regulations within the European Union and thereby improve governance. So some ideas are protecting the fundamental rights and guaranteeing freedom of movement for AI system, to facilitate development of a single market for lawful, secure, and trustworthy AI, and also to ensure legal certainty and enable investments. Again, a lot of stuff there to read, but the interesting thing that I'm going to dive into is what the Swedish government's review of this EU AI Act has sort of communicated. So I'll focus on aspects that are concerning financial crime. So this is not an exhaustive list of the review. So this is from a governmental perspective, so let's keep that in mind. And again, I haven't put quotations because I'm not a professional translator, but this is as close as it gets to the actual statements in the government document. That firstly, regulations should not counter authorities' capacities to fight crime. So what does that mean? If we're fighting crime in a bank, when it comes to anti-money laundering, we shouldn't regulate it at all or less. That's, again, a little bit vague, but at least the government thinks that when it comes to fighting crime and national security, we shouldn't include these application domains into this act. Secondly, national security and defense are actually, according to EU treaties, matters that should be decided by each and every country's own competences, and therefore should be outside of this act. And that goes both for public and private enforcers. And then there's this interesting passage that emphasizes free trade and free competition and collaboration with like-minded countries and actors. This kind of suggests that the government thinks that the EU should collaborate beyond the union, let's say with probably Canada or some other countries, but also to make sure that the AI systems that are developed in the EU can be used and sort of moved to other markets. Lastly, and I think this is the part that I find very interesting, is this emphasis to make sure that the regulation should not create impediments for research and innovation. And this is something that we're facing in the bank quite often as well. Where do you draw the line between development, discovery, or let's say research and production? Without research, you won't hit production. Without discovery, you won't get to development. So that's a key thing to keep in mind here. For those of you who like to read government documents, this is not 108 pages, but that's what it looks like. That's the actual header. So what are we doing in Swedbank when it comes to these complexities in the landscape? So I'll just talk about a number of focus areas. Naturally, we are obviously trying to improve the processes, not too often, of course. But it's impossible to have processes that can remain unadjusted for a long time. We're also looking into having the AI Center of Excellence as a vehicle to centralize model types and their fitness to different application domains. So when it comes to risk classification models, let's settle for logistic regression, for instance. Let's settle for logistic regression with let's say, this type of shrinkage or this type of, let's say, parameterization. Also knowing that a lot of magic in AI happens in feature engineering stage, we think that it's key to have that centralized and standardized feature store to be able to have scalable and sustainable development. We don't want our data scientists to create features from scratch over and over again, not just because it takes a lot of time, but also because it makes the regulatory perspective very difficult to have that clear correspondence between variables that go into the model and risk coverage, so to say. We've also started to propose the usage of pre-studies. It seems obvious, but many parts in the bank don't have that agile mindset. So for us, it's a way to also sell the agile story to other parts of the bank and to minimize, let's say, resources being mushroomed when it comes to projects. And of course, we're also focusing a lot when it comes to transparency, because at some point, even if you're using your logistic regression models, as soon as you start to alter that model with some, let's say, shrinkage or some, let's say, feature selection, you need to be able to explain what the model does. You also need to provide interpretability when it comes to why an observation, why a customer is risked in a certain class. And these things take a lot of time to bridge that gap between our data scientists and the business users in the bank to be able to have that common understanding. We cannot go from, Lime to SHAP to something else. We need to settle on something that works for everybody. Challenges. One challenge is this deterministic versus the probabilistic mindset. That's something that keeps coming back. We cannot have one-to-one mapping of risk factors and variables in models. That needs some time to get solved. Determining risk classes of AI applications, as the EU AI Act suggests, who determines that? How do we look at integrated AI applications? If you have multi-factor authentication in some process, that's also AI. How do we look at that entire sort of package? And the other thing is basically staffing resources. How are we supposed to provide the expertise needed to be able to have all these checks and balances? And lastly, I think one is if we imagine that customers are getting more and more tech savvy, new generations will be starting to use our products. Maybe they have expectations from our products in terms of ethics and privacy that are not included in these regulations. How do we meet their expectations when it comes to ethics and privacy? So I'll just go through this very fast. This is the conceptual work process that we have very roughly. Of course, down on the lower side, you have the tech side, the data science side. On the upper one, you have the business side. It's iterative. Then you move through these stages one by one. And this is what we thought 2-3 years ago was perfect. This covered everything. And this shouldn't fail at all. But then we have the regulatory things coming in, and now we're trying to add all of these things to it. So it gets very complicated. So again, I'm not going to go through this one by one, but the key thing here is we have to think end to end, again, like everything else, to include our data processing officers and risk and compliance officers from a very early stage, and not let's say, to be on a very clear track from the very beginning, to make sure that we don't have to do a lot of assessments over and over again. It goes with data, model, features, everything there. Final note. So this is a reflection that I had actually late yesterday. I thought, maybe this is a good way to show it, that, when we started this journey, we had the lone data scientist. After that, there were too many things for the data scientists, so there were more data scientists. Then they started to maybe send memes and GIFs to each other in their Slack channels, so we added an APO to keep track of what's going on. After that, we realized that we needed some engineering to make sure that the actual model hits production. Turned out we needed a lot of engineering because, again, it's finance and there's a lot of things to take into account when it comes to the different system. Once that grows, you need to add your release run engineers, Scrum Masters, and everything else because the APO can't keep track of everything by him or herself. And now this is where we are now in a sense. Like, we've had our data processing officers or risk and privacy officers and compliance managers involved in the process. So looking at this evolution, I'm just thinking maybe there is something that we're not doing right. Maybe we need to use tools and processes that are actually fit for what we're doing. Maybe we're getting the engineering backwards in a sense when it comes to how this thing has evolved in the past. Last slide. What I like to think about is electrification. When it comes to electrification, you just can't hand out a lot of electric vehicles to people and expect electrification to happen miraculously. Same thing goes with AI, especially in finance, in a reg-heavy environment. You need to have your infrastructure, insurance products, workshops need to have to readapt, safety measures have to readapt. You need to have the entire thing there to be able to do this. The other thing is like, music without notes and instruments. It doesn't sound that nice, but it's a nice concept. And that's the same thing with AI in finance in a regulation-heavy environment. So not to kind of go through this again exhaustively, I think that this is, again, a personal opinion. I think that we need to have purpose-fit infrastructure, tools, and processes, and also data management processes. Without those, it's very difficult to fit AI as we have it today to finance, because most of your data scientists or AI practitioners like to look at Google, look at Meta, look at other companies, use deep learning, use very advanced stuff, but those things are not really adapted for usage in finance. Those things were made, and then somebody came and added explainability to it. It's not the correct way to do it, so to say. So I think what we need is that increased collaboration. There has to be some place, some initiative where you can have governments, academia, researchers all in the same place, and to build something that is purpose-fit, so to say. At this point, I think we are trying to cover a lot of things and kind of reverse engineer a lot, which is something that is not leading to AI having that impact that it was supposed to have in finance and many other industries. So on that note, thanks for listening in.
Thank you so much.